You've probably said it to your students before. I don't just want the answer. I want to know how you got there. But when you ask for critical thinking, what do you actually get? Sometimes it's silence. And sometimes it's whatever ChatGPT spat out 5 seconds earlier. In a world full of instant answers, encouraging students to slow down and actually think, that's not easy. But it's also never been more important. Welcome back to the What and Who of EDU, where we bring you insights from the leading educators, researchers, and innovators who are shaping the future of teaching and learning. On our podcast, we share real-world classroom strategies that can help you create a more impactful and effective learning environment. I'm your host, Marissa Bluestone, and today we're tackling one of the most assigned, most assessed, and least clearly defined skills in education: critical thinking. From sneaky iClicker questions to old school annotation, today we have 10 tips from instructors who have been there, taught that, and have the student evaluations to prove it. If you'd like to learn more about our featured educators, we've added their bios in the show notes. The fear of not getting a perfect grade can shut thinking down. So Dr. Kristen Monroe, assistant professor of chemistry at Landmark College, she decided to stop penalizing mistakes. Because what if the best way to teach critical thinking was to stop grading it the first time around? Which takes us to tip 1, remove the fear of failure.
One of the things that I've learned is that it is really important to stimulate learning instead of truncating learning. And so I give my students unlimited attempts with no penalties on automatically graded assignments, and then the opportunity to revise one revision for hand graded assignments. I find that this removes the fear of failure and encourages problem solving. I think that if you give a student one attempt on an assignment, the challenge is that they're not incentivized to go back and redo it. But if you give them those multiple attempts, then they have more of an incentive to keep going with it, and they're less likely to just get frustrated and give up.
Monroe isn't just building skills, she's rewiring student mindsets. Students can try, fail, revise, and try again without ever losing points or momentum. Of course, it's hard to think clearly when fear is in the driver's seat, especially when it may mean being wrong out loud. If your students are glued to their phones, it might not be distraction, it might be deflection. We learn in tip 2 that Dr. Margaret Holloway, assistant professor of English at Clark Atlanta University, tackles this by going full analog. We're talking hard copies, handwritten notes, and zero doom scrolling.
What I've been seeing the past couple of semesters is that students who come into my classroom are so heavily reliant on their phones and what other people are saying. And not even the sense of that they're lazy, they're scared to voice their opinion on something. They go to the internet to see who's saying what or what the right answer is. It's like they're almost scared to say, well, hey, I think this or I believe this. So I go back to the traditional way of doing things. I print out hard copies of readings and we go through them together as a class. I'm not a professor that makes their students put their phones away, but for critical thinking, I do.
That's why Dr. Holloway takes things offline, because sometimes the only way forward is, back to paper, pens, and process.
So just recently, we had a critical thinking class session and the students read James Baldwin. If Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is. And so I printed out hard copies of that and we went through 3 sections of that reading: a background of who James Baldwin was, a conversation about Black rhetoric, and the actual essay on Black English. And I had them go through the critical thinking process, preview the text, annotate it. If you see a word that you don't know, put a question mark by it so you can go back and find a definition. If there's something that you have a question about, write the question out in the margins. Underline things that are interesting to you or something that stands out. Going through that process teaches them how to be critical thinkers. And I find that doing something as basic as that, having them put pen to paper to go through the critical thinking process is very effective for my students. And every time I always get a very fruitful discussion amongst my students. They don't like that they have to flip through all those pages and things like that, but they do see the value in it. And I can always see that being applied in their later assignments. So it's very basic method, old school for me because I used to do it back when I was an undergrad, but it works. It still works.
In her class, students can't Google their way through Baldwin, not when their phones are zipped up and their thoughts are front and center. It's quiet, it's old school, and it works. Dr. Amy Goodman, a senior lecturer in the mathematics department at Baylor University, believes that real growth happens when students learn to think about how they think. Because sometimes the best person to teach you is you.
Critical thinking is at the heart of what I do in my classrooms. So I'm a big believer in self-regulated learning. There's been a high correlation between self-regulated learning theory and student success, particularly in mathematics, which is what I teach. And self-regulated learning focuses on students' cognition, metacognition, and affect. And so cognition you can really address through direct instruction where you're telling them what it is they need to know. But just telling them what they need to know isn't the same as letting them have a chance to actually do the procedure or the process or the practice using the concept that you've just instructed them with. So I like to teach according to a flipped model. I'd offload the cognition and direct instruction part to video lectures that happen outside of the class so that when they come to class, we can really focus on that metacognitive component, that how are you thinking about what you know? How are you thinking about strategies to solve problems and different techniques to engage? So that's what we spend our time doing.
But here's the catch. Those rich reflective classroom moments only happen when students show up ready.
When you come to class, the assumption is, and I have been rewarded in this assumption, that students have watched the video lecture prior to coming to class. And of course, there are ways to assess that they have done that. But in most of my classes, I just ask them to do it and then talk to them like they've done it. And I find that far and away, most students really do come to class prepared and ready to do what you've planned for them to do in class.
Dr. Goodman assumes they've watched the video lecture, and most of them do. Why? Because she treats them like they have. That quiet trust builds a culture of accountability and frees up class for the how, not just the what. By the end of a session, her students are sharing strategies, solving problems, and teaching each other, which, spoiler alert, is a very advanced form of critical thinking. But more on that in a future episode. But critical thinking isn't only about reflection. It's also about the questions we ask. Dr. Erica Martinez, professor of instruction at the University of South Florida, never answers a question directly. Instead, she leads students down the rabbit hole with even more questions. So tip 4 reminds us to channel our inner Socrates.
I think it's easy to encourage critical thinking inside the classroom. Socratic questioning is my go-to. I'm constantly engaging the students. When students have a question, I almost always answer it with another question, sometimes a series of questions. I push students to justify their reasoning with follow-up questions. I teach microeconomics and a lot of theory classes, so ultimately the question is why. You cannot just give an answer, you also have to provide their reasoning. And then also ask them, well, what happens if something else changes? Or how would this relate to some real world policy? And this forces them to engage more deeply rather than memorize concepts.
Students might grow now, but later they're arguing like pros and thinking like them too. Socrates would be proud. We say we want students to think like scientists, but how often do we actually let them? Dr. Charlotte Dearauge, assistant professor of biology at York University, flipped the usual lecture script. Instead of just describing the scientific method, she invites students to use it in real time. Tip 5, teach the process, not just the point.
I teach both biochemistry and molecular biology-based courses, as well as first-year biology, and emphasizes these disciplines. And I always try to present concepts following the scientific method in a hypothesis-driven manner. And then secondly, many lecture sessions are structured to include experimental results to interpret. And what does this entail? What does this look like? For instance, during lecture for a third-year molecular biology course, which covers a lab technique like qPCR, I will provide the data output. Students are required to interpret the information. We'll provide scenarios in our molecular biology course where we ask if the hypothetical samples are positive for COVID. And students perform the calculations, they'll submit trends they've identified during our lecture in real time. Providing these many scenarios encourages students to develop hypotheses and also actively apply content that they've been taught.
By turning content into investigation, her students don't just hear about science. They start to think like scientists. And that's the point. What do minimum wage laws, COVID learning loss, and legalized marijuana have in common? They're headlines because they give us some of the biggest questions out there for economists and for Dr. Ryan Herzog's economics students. The associate professor at Gonzaga University uses real-world issues to push critical thinking beyond the textbook because he knows just how fun economics is and thinks students should know too, which is our 6th tip. Give students problems worth solving.
This is partly where I like economics is there's a lot of research over fun areas. And so whether it's at a principles or an intermediate or even like at a field course, I like introducing them to some of the kind of research questions that we're talking about. And it might be something as simple as the minimum wage. That's a concept every student easily understands. And I asked them, okay, so in Washington State, every January, the minimum wage goes up. We have one of the highest minimum wages in the country. And so it becomes something students already largely know about. And I ask them, so as economists, we're often asked to assess what the effects of the minimum wage are. How does it affect employment? How does it affect poverty? What are the overall implications of it? So how do we do that? How do we test that? And so I'm always asking them to think about, here's a question that we are being asked. How do we think about the assessment of it, right? Not to the point of actually gathering the data and doing it, but thinking of the problems and thinking about some of the challenges that come with solving these problems. And so there's all sorts of these examples in economics that you can bring in and ask them to think about these problems.
Instead of giving students the clean version of a concept, he hands them the messy version of reality. What would they need to know? How would they need to test it? What assumptions would they have to unpack? So many questions.
In Washington State, we legalized marijuana, gosh, I would say almost 10 years ago now. Lots of questions around that, right? Or COVID. How would we assess potentially learning loss from COVID and things like that? Or how do we get at these problems? And so it's getting away from the standard textbook story, but it's still, we use models, we can apply all these concepts, but it's getting them to be curious about the world and ask those questions over, how do I solve this? How would we answer that question in ways that force them to think about it?
Dr. Herzog knows that when students care about the question, they'll stick around for the complexity. Because critical thinking starts with curiosity and maybe a question that's just too good to ignore. Dr. Mike May has taught math for 30 years. So he knows that his students understand the material when they can explain it to someone else. Specifically, to a curious, easily confused 9-year-old who thinks you walk on water. So our 7th tip is from the lower division coordinator in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at St. Louis University. And he makes them explain it like a kid is listening.
So one of the things I do with critical thinking is the setup is your nephew or niece who's 9 and adores you, wants to know what you're doing and why. Explain it to your nephew or niece who's 9, who thinks you walk on water. And then I get to be the nephew or niece and ask all of the misinterpreting questions. And so they have to get it specific, because whatever they say, I'm going to come up with a way to misinterpret it.
Dr. May plays the role of a kid and asks every innocent, derailing, and perfectly misinformed question he could think of. And he doesn't let his students hide behind the jargon. If you want to see a student mentally check out, just say the words critical thinking exercise. Dr. Ripley Stickle, teaching professor of biology at West Virginia University, gets it. And she has a better idea, which takes us to tip 8. Hide the critical thinking in plain sight.
For critical thinking, I try to hide it. If I tell them it's critical thinking, the door closes and they shut out on me. And so I've even used lately clicker questions to build critical thinking skills. So for an example, when we're talking about cells, I'll do a first clicker question that says, what's the oldest type of cell? And students know prokaryotes. Our choices are prokaryotes, eukaryotes, they're prokaryotes. Okay, that's easy. And then I'll have them do the next clicker question. What domain is the oldest? And they're like, well, bacteria. Bacteria is the oldest domain. Fantastic. And I'll say, well, what type of cell are bacteria? And I didn't tell them that, but they're able to take, oh, well, the oldest are bacteria and the oldest cells are prokaryotes. They must be prokaryotes. And so I allowed them to take that, they just did critical thinking and put it together without me telling them. And I'll tell them after that, those 3 clicker questions that take maybe 50 seconds to do, they're really short and fast. And I'll be like, you just figured that out. That's critical thinking skills right there. And we'll do that early in the semester just to prime them. And then it teaches them to start connecting the dots and building those skills themselves.
She uses a sequence of quick, low-stakes iClicker questions to build logic chains in real time. One question leads to the next, and suddenly students are connecting dots they didn't even know were related. It's fast, it's quiet, and it's wildly effective. And here's a bingo bonus. No one has to say the phrase higher order thinking. Not even once. At a time when misinformation spreads faster than facts, Jennifer Duncan, Associate Professor of English at Georgia State University's Perimeter College, trains her students to spot hallucinations because she believes that AI isn't a critical thinking killer. It's a critical thinking prompt. And tip 9 is to let AI make those mistakes.
I think that critical thinking is the one part of teaching that will not change, whether AI comes along, whether students are doing online or face-to-face or hybrid. In the world we live, being able to look at a piece of information and think about it critically is more important than ever. So one of the things that I'm really doing that's working well in my classes, especially my freshman level students, is having them interact with AI in a way that causes them to think critically about what the AI produces. So instead of asking them to give their work to ChatGPT, for example, I might say to them, ask ChatGPT to create a thesis statement. And now you tell me what does and does not work about that, or you tell me what hallucinations that you spot in that. So in doing that, I'm having them think critically about what the AI produces. But for our students, all these different types of media kind of merge together. So I'm now also training them, when you read a news article, what hallucinations can you spot? What works about this or what doesn't? When you hear a speech, what works, what doesn't? What's a hallucination? So it's really asking them to use this tool where they could be tempted to just give over everything they think. And instead, let's use this to think about information literacy overall.
Her students spot misinformation, bias, logical gaps, and even conspiracy theories. Jennifer doesn't tell her students to avoid ChatGPT. She tells them to challenge it, to critique it, and to apply the same lens to campaign speeches, news stories, and TikToks that claims science says. Nothing tests your understanding like having to explain it out loud with a mic to a room full of people in your lab class. That's Dr. Derek Harmon's approach at Ohio State, and it's our final tip. If they can teach it, well, they know it.
One of the biggest things that I have implemented, which I think has been really successful, is with anatomy. We have obviously a lab component where they'll do full body dissection to learn all about the anatomy kind of in its normal position, or in situ, as we say. And I require at the end of each lab session, I assign a lab group to do a live teaching demonstration to the entire class. And the way that we think about this in kind of this Bloom's taxonomy or learning kind of hierarchy is, if you can explain a topic to somebody else, that is essentially the highest level of learning that you can kind of get to. And so even though these students have maybe just learned this content that morning in lecture, and then they just dissected it and saw it for literally the first time that day, by them forcing themselves to teach each other quickly and then to do a live demonstration, they, without a doubt, feel much more confident in that information. And it's funny because day one, when I tell them that this is what we're going to do each lab session, they are like deer in headlights. Their eyes get big, they're nervous, they're scared. But at the end, I can see from my comments, they call out and they thank me for requiring that, because they said, I without a doubt knew that content better than anything else, so that I felt like I could spend time studying the other content more.
So they explain what they've just dissected, how it works, and why it matters on camera, and often after just learning about it that morning. It's terrifying, it's empowering, and it works. Because when you're holding the mic, you better know your material. So, what did we learn today? Critical thinking isn't just a concept, it's a craft. And like any good craft project, it gets messy. It requires patience, and it involves more than a few false starts. These 10 instructors, they didn't rely on magic formulas or TED Talk slogans. They shared strategies that work in real classrooms with real students. They showed us that critical thinking isn't a checkbox. It's a meandering, question-filled path to figuring things out. And as we've learned today, that path, it matters way more than the final answer. Huge thanks to our featured educators for opening up their classrooms and sharing what works. Go follow them, thank them, or just nod knowingly at their sheer brilliance. If you found this episode helpful, share it with a colleague, or that one friend who still calls their syllabus a living document, but hasn't updated it since 2019. And if you've got a clever critical thinking trick up your sleeve, especially one involving sticky notes, iClickers, or dramatic readings of James Baldwin, leave us a voicemail at 512-765-4688. And you might just hear yourself on a future episode. Bonus points if it's the kind of advice that makes us laugh and learn. Until next time, I'm Marissa Bluestone, and this is the What and Who of EDU.